Okay, let's dive in. We're tackling this monumental question today. The fall of Rome. It's a story, isn't it? It's fascinated people, historians, everyone, for centuries. And you can see why.
Absolutely. You picture Rome, you see this colossal empire, unbeatable, stretching forever, buildings meant to last millennia.
Exactly. Built to last. And yet, poof. Well, not poof, but it became this distant memory, at least in the West.
And that throws up all these huge questions people still argue about. Why
Yeah.
did it fall? When did it actually,
Or
happen?
maybe the most interesting one. Did it really fall? Like in the way we imagine empires just collapsing overnight.
That's the crux of it, isn't it? The whole idea of Rome falling is something we've kind of constructed after the fact. We're talking about this entity that just defied collapse for so, so long.
Uh-huh.
And its end, if you can call it that, looks much more like a really slow, messy transformation than some sudden event, which makes you ask, what exactly fell? What are we even measuring?
Yeah, defining terms is key here.
Totally. And the academic debate is wild. It's like this giant historical game of Clue, was it the Vandals in the library with the lead pipe in 455?
Right. Or was it Constantine, maybe, back in 312 with Christianity becoming a
Or
thing?
do you stretch it all the way out to 1453 when the Ottomans took Constantinople, the Eastern Roman capital? There are just so many theories, so many potential culprits. It's complex.
It really is. And that's what we want to do in this deep dive. Not just give you a list of who historians blame, but really unpack the history of the late empire.
Look at the sources, see what they tell us.
Exactly. Offer some insights, connect the dots where we can, and hopefully help you, listening, draw your own conclusions. Because, spoiler alert, there's no single easy answer.
Not even close. What the evidence points to isn't one big disaster. It's more like this dangerous feedback loop. Rome's ambition kind of outstripped its ability to manage everything.
Overstretched itself.
Pretty much. Created these internal weaknesses that made it vulnerable. It wasn't just external attacks, though those definitely played a huge part. It's this a whole mix of factors playing out over hundreds of years.
Which makes this story, well, intriguingly complicated, but also super relevant, I think.
Oh, absolutely. The Roman Empire, I mean, think about it. From its mythical beginnings to this sprawling reality, it was probably more culturally diverse, more economically productive, more connected by infrastructure than anything the world had seen before.
All roads lead to Rome.
Right. It wasn't just a saying. In many ways, they really did. This empire seemed to have cracked the code for lasting power. It wasn't just about conquering, it was about creating this shared Roman identity, integrating people, at least for a while.
But you're saying even under that shiny surface, there were problems lurking.
Always. Fundamental vulnerabilities, just waiting for the right pressures to bring them out. And those pressures started building earlier than you might think, even during the so-called Golden Age.
Right, the famous Pax Romana. But before we get there, let's just quickly trace how Rome got to be an empire in the first place.
Yeah.
Started as a kingdom, right? Flawed one.
Yep. Kings got kicked out, led to the Republic, high ideals, civic duty, elections, but also tons of infighting, rich versus poor, powerful families battling it out.
Sounds familiar.
Doesn't it? And after centuries of this, the Roman people were kind of exhausted by the constant conflict. They seemed ready for someone strong to just take charge, bring some stability.
Enter Julius Caesar.
Exactly. Mid-1st century BCE, he gathers immense power. Military genius, popular leader, eventually becomes dictator for life, dictator perpetuo.
Perpetual dictator. Doesn't sound very Republican.
It wasn't. He expanded Rome's power, he was effective, people loved him. But the old guard, the senators, they saw the writing on the wall. He wasn't giving up power. Ever.
So they feared a king,
The
basically.
king in all but name. And that fear, that deep-seated fear of monarchy returning, led straight to his assassination. Ides of March, 44 BCE, boom.
But killing Caesar didn't save the Republic, did it?
Ironically, no, it did the opposite. It unleashed chaos, more civil wars, brutal ones, as all these powerful guys scrambled to grab Caesar's power.
And one of those guys was Octavian, Caesar's heir.
His adopted son, yeah.
All right.
And Octavian was sharp. Master politician, brilliant strategist. He finished what Caesar started, defeated his rivals like Mark Antony and Cleopatra at Actium. Big naval battle.
And that led to Egypt becoming Roman.
Yep. Annexed Egypt, ending that whole Hellenistic era there, the Greek influence that had dominated since Alexander the Great centuries before. Octavian became even more powerful than Caesar.
So powerful, nobody dared cross him.
Pretty much. The Senate, maybe genuinely impressed, maybe just scared, gave him the title Augustus the Revered One. He effectively became the first emperor ruling for life.
So the guys who killed Caesar, to stop a king ended up paving the way for an emperor. Wow.
History has a funny way, doesn't it? And this new system, this empire, set the stage. Hereditary rule was back, sometimes good emperors, sometimes, well, disastrous ones.
Under this empire, Rome just exploded, right? Conquests everywhere.
An insatiable hunger. Europe, Asia Minor, North Africa. Italy was the heart, but the conquered lands became provinces, governed locally, but the rules were simple.
Pay your taxes, keep the peace.
Don't make the emperor angry. And for the first couple of centuries CE, it worked remarkably well. That's the period we call the Pax Romana, Roman peace.
The golden age. Stability, prosperity, culture flourishing. That's pretty good.
It was, on the surface. But even then, beneath that calm veneer, you had trouble brewing, especially religious trouble.
Ah, okay. So traditional Roman religion.
Yeah.
Lots of gods.
Polytheistic, yeah. Jupiter at the top, but tons of others. Gods who are often pretty human, actually petty, passionate. Worship involved big public sacrifices, temples, festivals, all designed to keep the gods happy and the state successful.
And they were okay with adding new gods.
Very okay. Super flexible. As the empire expanded, they'd just absorb local deities. Like Mithras, this Persian god who became really popular with soldiers, secretive cults, kind of mysterious.
It was pragmatic. Religion tied to the state's success.
Fundamentally, temples were public works. The emperor's job included managing that relationship with the divine. You see statues of them pouring libations, leading sacrifices. It reinforced their legitimacy.
A flexible system for a diverse empire, but then something different comes along.
Exactly. A truly monotheistic religion. One god, exclusive worship. It was a massive challenge Rome hadn't really faced before.
And that's Christianity.
Right. Coming out of Judaism, another monotheistic faith that Rome often found problematic. Christianity, based on Jesus' teachings, got pretty harsh treatment initially.
The stories about lions in the Colosseum may be exaggerated.
The specific large-scale arena executions are harder to pin down historically than popular culture suggests, but Rome definitely persecuted Christians. They saw any new faith, especially one that rejected their gods and the emperor's divinity, as a threat.
Because it challenged the whole system.
Directly. One god. No sacrifices to Jupiter or the emperor. A kingdom not of this world. That flew in the face of everything Roman religion stood for. It undermined the emperor's authority, which was often linked to being divine or descended from gods.
So this religious tension is simmering. And then we get to Emperor Commodus.
Ah, Commodus. He takes the throne in 177 CE, and he really marks a turning point. The end, arguably, of that stable Pax Romana.
He was young.
The youngest ever, 15, inherited this massive, powerful empire at its peak. But his rule, dictated by emotion, recklessness, chaos, he exposed how vulnerable the whole system was to just one bad individual at the top.
Especially one without the right temperament, you said.
Totally lacking it. He quickly became notorious, fickle, dictatorial, obsessed with gladiators.
He fought as one, didn't he?
Yeah, which was scandalous enough, but accounts say his opponents were expected to just lose, to die quietly. Shows you the kind of power and cruelty involved. He built this huge cult of personality, called himself Hercules Reborn.
Joaquin Phoenix in Gladiator captured that intensity, didn't he?
He really did. A reign defined by chaos. And it ended chaotically, too. Assassinated after 15 years. Strangled by a wrestler in his bath.
Classy.
Right. The Senate immediately declared him an enemy of the state, tore down his statues, tried to erase his name damnatio memoriae. But killing him didn't fix things. It just opened the floodgates.
So Commodus's death wasn't the end of the chaos. It was the start of something worse.
Oh, yeah. It kicked off arguably Rome's darkest period, a complete nosedive into anarchy. First, you get the Year of the Five Emperors, 193 CE.
5 emperors in 1 year.
Insane, right? One guy lasts 3 months, gets assassinated. Another literally buys the throne from the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's bodyguards.
Wait, he paid the guards to make him emperor?
Yep, and then they killed him a few weeks later when someone else offered more money. It was just utter turmoil, a revolving door of power grabs and assassinations.
And this wasn't just a blip.
Not at all. This launched the crisis of the 3rd century. Basically, 100 straight years of this madness. Think about it. Out of about 30 emperors in that rough period, only maybe 5 died naturally.
25 assassinated or killed in battle. That's unbelievable.
It's staggering. And all this time, you've got constant civil wars. Rival generals carving out chunks of the empire, fighting each other for land and power. It's like the Republic's worst nightmares, but on an imperial scale.
What did this do to, everyday life? The economy.
Catastrophic. To pay armies, bribe guards, reward supporters, emperors just churned out money, debasing the currency. Result, runaway inflation. It totally wrecked the Roman economy.
Though money became worthless.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Savings wiped out, trade disrupted. And those grand public works, roads, aqueducts, temples, grinding to a halt, no funds, just this pervasive feeling of doom and gloom.
And while Rome's fighting itself, are outsiders taking advantage?
You bet. Goths, Franks, other tribes starting to push in from the north, the Persian Empire reborn in the east, invading Roman territory. It was pressure from all sides.
And plagues, too. You mentioned plagues earlier.
Yes, devastating outbreaks like the plague of Cyprians swept through, killing huge numbers of people, crippled the army, wrecked the economy even further, added to that sense of despair.
It sounds like the whole thing was about to shatter.
It almost did. The empire literally split into three parts for a while. You had the Gallic Empire in the west, Britain, Gaul, Spain, and the Palmyrene Empire in the east, Egypt, the Levant, functioning as separate states.
Augustus's worst nightmare, you said.
Absolutely, his unified empire fracturing. So yeah, recap the 3rd century. Invasions, rogue states breaking off, plagues, emperors murdered constantly, economy in ruins. It looked like the end was nigh.
But it wasn't. Somehow Rome pulls back from the brink.
Almost miraculously, yes. Enter Emperor Diocletian. He comes along and tries to, duct tape the whole thing back together with some major reforms.
Okay, so Diocletian. He must have had a plan. How did that grand experiment unfold?
Diocletian was smart. He was a military guy. Took power in 285 CE, ruled for 20 solid years. And he understood the core problem. The empire was just too damn big to run effectively from one place.
The scale issue.
Exactly. His solution was radical, the tetrarchy. Rule by 4, he split the empire's administration. 2 senior emperors, the Augusti, and 2 junior emperors, the Caesars. Each pair controlled half the empire, east and west.
So 4 rulers instead of 1. How did that help?
The idea was to keep government much more local. Quicker responses to border threats, better administration in the provinces, trying to manage this objectively way too big empire.
Makes sense. Did it work?
Administratively, it had some success for a while, but some of his other reforms, less so. He tried to enforce religious unity by launching another major persecution of Christians.
Trying to force loyalty through sacrifice again, like Decius.
Yeah, demanding public sacrifice to the old gods. It didn't really work and caused immense suffering, but his structural changes were significant. And then he did something truly remarkable. He retired. In 305 CE, Diocletian voluntarily gave up being emperor to go farm cabbages.
He just quit being emperor.
Yep. A huge cultural statement echoing the old Republican hero Cincinnatus, like, I saved the state, now I'm going back to my farm. A massive power move, relinquishing power, trying to set an example for orderly succession.
Wow. Did the other tetrarchs follow his lead?
Not a chance. The minute Diocletian retired, the remaining Augustan Caesars started fighting each other for ultimate power.
So much for orderly succession. Back to civil war.
Depressingly, yes. It proved, once again, that Rome's biggest enemy was often itself. The system designed to prevent chaos ended up fueling it again.
And this is where Constantine comes in.
This is exactly where Constantine emerges from the chaos. He was the Western Augustus, based in Britain and Gaul, and he starts battling his rivals.
Constantine really did shake things up, didn't he? Especially with Christianity. That feels like a game changer for Roman identity.
Absolutely pivotal. So Constantine's fighting his rival Maxentius for control of Italy. Before the key battle of the Milvian Bridge, just outside Rome in 312 CE, the story goes he has a vision.
The vision of the cross, or the CHRO symbol.
CHRO, yeah, the first 2 letters of Christ's name in Greek. Sees it in the sky, hears a voice, in this sign, conquer.
And he did.
He did. Painted the symbol on his soldiers' shields, won the battle decisively, killed Maxentius, marched into Rome the victor.
Did he fully convert right then? Become a Christian?
It's debated how deep his personal faith went initially, but he was convinced enough. The very next year, 313 CE, he issues the Edict of Milan with his Eastern colleague Licinius.
Legalizing Christianity.
Exactly, ending almost 300 years of on-again, off-again persecution. A massive shift. And this wasn't just about tolerance, was it? You said it fundamentally altered the state-religion relationship.
Profoundly. He essentially made a deal, the universal empire aligning itself with this growing universal church. It changed the power dynamics entirely, politically and religiously. He even used that old Roman trick, syncretism, blending beliefs. How so?
For a while, in official art and coins, Jesus was sort of linked or visually compared to the Roman sun god Sol Invictus, making Christianity seem a bit less alien, maybe more familiar to traditional Romans. For maybe a century, you see Jesus kind of rubbing shoulders with Jupiter in the public imagination.
A strange mix. But ultimately, Christianity's rise challenged the old ways, right? The emperor's divinity, integrating new people.
Hugely. The old system relied on flexible polytheism and the emperor having a divine connection. Christianity, being monotheistic, couldn't accept emperor worship or easily absorb other gods. This chipped away the emperor's traditional authority and made integrating conquered peoples harder. It just fundamentally clashed with Roman assumptions about religion and power.
Okay, so Constantine legalizes Christianity. Then what? He becomes sole ruler.
Yep. He eventually defeats his last rival, Licinius, in 324 CE. Unites the whole empire under his command, and then he makes another huge move, founds a new capital city in the east.
Constantinople, modern Istanbul.
Right. Initially called Nova Roma, New Rome. It was a statement. A victory city, strategically placed, easier to defend, closer to wealthy eastern provinces and dangerous frontiers. A massive display of his power.
And he decked it out like Rome.
He did. Built his own versions of famous Roman landmarks. But here's the kicker. He stripped statues and artworks from cities all over the empire, especially pagan ones, to decorate Constantinople. Basically denuded other places to make his new capital glorious.
Wow. So a mix of old pagan art and new Christian favor.
A striking mix, yeah.
Right.
Reflects his transitional nature. He was also apparently much better at economic reforms than Diocletian, stabilizing the currency, improving tax collection.
But you mentioned a potential problem earlier, his reliance on foreign mercenaries.
Yes. He continued, even expanded, the practice of using Germanic tribes, foederati, for border defense, outsourcing security. This seemed practical at the time, but it definitely sowed seeds for future trouble. Unintended consequences, maybe, but probably unavoidable given the recruitment issues.
So for the rest of the 300s, Rome sort of holds on. Administration split sometimes united.
Pretty much. A period of relative, if somewhat uneasy, stability after the chaos of the 3rd century. But those underlying issues, the economy, the military composition, the sheer size, the religious shifts, they hadn't gone away. The cracks were still there.
Okay, so the empire is dealing with all this internal stuff, but the external pressures are mounting. You mentioned the Goths, the Vandals. These really start to hit hard now, right? Especially in the West.
They do, and it connects back to those frontiers. Think about Hadrian's Wall, way back in the 2nd century. It wasn't just defense, it was a statement. This is Rome. Beyond here is not Rome, a symbol of power.
But walls aren't always solid barriers.
Exactly. Physical barriers define edges, but they're often porous. They entice as much as they repel. And Rome's frontiers were always incredibly porous. You constantly had barbarians, Germanic people, others serving in the Roman army.
So it wasn't just us versus them?
Not at all. It was a complex mix. Invaders, sure, but also waves of refugees fleeing other conflicts, like the Huns. Economic migrants looking for opportunity. The lines blurred. It get harder and harder to tell who was Roman and who wasn't, especially on the frontiers.
And this changed the empire how? You said it turned it inside out?
Yeah, because more and more Roman money, resources, attention got focused on these border zones and the people making the big decisions. Increasingly, it was the generals out there, the soldiers on the ground. They became the real power brokers, not necessarily the emperor far away in Rome or Constantinople. Their loyalties were often more personal, more local.
Which makes the empire vulnerable if a big external shock hits.
Precisely. And that shock came with the Huns, this nomadic, fearsome group pushing west from Central Asia in the late 4th century. They weren't necessarily aiming at Rome initially, but they displaced everyone in their path.
The domino effect you mentioned.
Exactly. Ostrogoths, Visigoths, lots of Goths, other Germanic tribes, suddenly push off their lands, needing somewhere to go. And the path of least resistance, often westward into Roman territory.
So invasions were often migrations driven by fear.
Often, yes. A big, awkward, bloody domino effect. That's why it was gradual, why Rome tried to incorporate some groups as federati allied troops under their own leaders settled on Roman land, a way to manage the pressure.
But managing it didn't always go well. The Visigoths, for example.
A key moment. In 376 CE, large groups of Visigoths, fleeing the Huns, arrive at the Danube frontier, begging for refuge inside the empire. They promise loyalty, soldiers for the army, in return for land and safety.
Sounds like a potential win-win. New recruits.
It could have been, but Roman officials on the ground mishandled it terribly. Corruption, exploitation. They let the Goths starve during a famine, reportedly even forced them to sell their children into slavery for dog meat. Just horrific treatment.
Unsurprisingly, the Goths weren't happy.
They were furious. They rebelled. This kicks off the Gothic War, and it leads to the Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE.
A disaster for Rome.
An absolute catastrophe. The Visigoths completely crushed the Eastern Roman army. Emperor Valens himself was killed. 2/3 of his army wiped out. It sent shockwaves through the empire, showed Rome was beatable.
So what happened then? Did Rome kick them out?
They couldn't, really. The next emperor, Theodosius I, eventually made peace. But it was a peace treaty unlike any before. He allowed the Goths to settle inside the empire, in the Balkans, as a distinct, autonomous group, still armed, under their own leaders, but officially allied to Rome.
Wow. An entire nation armed, living inside Roman borders. That sounds risky.
Unprecedented, and it set a dangerous precedent. These tensions didn't just vanish. Enter Alaric, king of the Visigoths.
He'd served Rome, right?
He had, under Theodosius. But after Theodosius died, Alaric felt his people weren't getting a fair deal, weren't given the status or permanent homeland they deserved. So he starts campaigning, demanding recognition. He even besieges Rome in 401.
Who stopped him then?
Stilicho, this brilliant general, half-Vandal himself, probably the last truly great commander the West had, he beat Alaric back. But the Western emperor, Honorius Theodosius' son, was becoming increasingly useless.
The guy with the chicken.
That's the one. He moved the capital to Ravenna, a safer coastal city, around 402. Then, disastrously, in 408, he gets paranoid or is manipulated into executing Stilicho, accuses him of treason.
Executing his best general, while facing threats like Alaric.
Terrible decision. It left Italy and Rome itself wide open, defenseless.
So Alaric came back.
Immediately. Later in 408, he besieges Rome again. The city pays a huge ransom gold, silver, silk to make him leave. They even set up a puppet emperor briefly to negotiate. Alaric mainly wanted land for his people.
Did Honorius agree? From Ravenna?
Nope. Honorius refused to give any meaningful territory. Stubborn, short-sighted. So Alaric, frustrated, marches on Rome a third time in 410, and this time he sacks it.
The sack of Rome, 410. Huge symbolic moment. How bad was the actual damage?
Physically, maybe not as utterly devastating as later sacks. Some sources say the Visigoths were relatively restrained, focused on loot. But psychologically, horrifying. The eternal city, violated by barbarians. It hadn't happened in 800 years.
And Honorius heard Rome had perished and worried about his chicken.
That story, true or not, perfectly captures the disconnect. It was a massive blow to Roman prestige and morale, a sign the Western Empire was truly crumbling.
But Rome survived that sack. More trouble came later, right? Attila the Hun.
Yep, around 450, Attila brings his Huns into Italy, threatening Rome itself. But then another famous encounter, Pope Leo I rides out to meet him.
And persuades him to turn back.
Legends say divine intervention, angels appearing. More likely explanations involve a hefty bribe, maybe disease in Attila's army, or strategic concerns about being cut off. Whatever the reason, Attila withdrew, went back, got married, and promptly died on his wedding night.
Talk about anticlimactic. But Rome's luck didn't hold.
Not for long. Just 5 years later, 455 CE, the Vandals arrive, another Germanic tribe who'd carved out a kingdom in North Africa. They sail up the Tiber and give Rome a proper sacking. Really bad.
This is where we get the word vandalism.
Exactly. They were systematic. Didn't destroy everything. Many big monuments survived, but they looted thoroughly for 2 weeks, damaged smaller buildings, shipped treasures back to Carthage, and yeah, sources say lots of people were killed or enslaved. It was brutal. Vandals bad.
So the West is getting hammered. What about the East? And that permanent split?
Right. Back to Emperor Theodosius I. In 395 CE, just before he died, he formally divided the empire in his will between his two young sons. Arcadius got the East, Honorius got the West. Permanently.
And he also made Christianity the only legal religion. Outlawed paganism.
He did. Solidified Christianity's dominance. But that decision to permanently split the empire, looking back, it seems like it sealed the West's fate.
Left it for dead, you said earlier. Why?
Because the West was just weaker, poorer, less urbanized, less stable food supplies. The East had Egypt's grain basket. And crucially, the West had a much longer, harder-to-defend border against all those migrating tribes.
So fewer resources, bigger problems.
Exactly. And every time a chunk of territory was lost to a new Germanic kingdom, Franks in Gaul, Visigoths in Spain, Vandals in Africa, the Western Emperor had even less tax revenue to pay the army. It was a death spiral.
Meanwhile, the East is okay.
Relatively okay. Based in Constantinople, wealthy, better defended, it kept going strong. It survived, evolved, and thrived for another 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire.
And they so called themselves Romans.
Absolutely. They saw themselves as the direct, unbroken continuation of the Roman Empire until 1453. The contrast with the West's fate in the 5th century is stark.
So within a century that split, the Western Empire is just Italy, basically.
Pretty much. Dramatically shrunk. And then comes the moment everyone points to as the end. 476 CE.
Odoacer.
Odoacer, a Germanic general leading a mixed force of Roman auxiliary troops, mostly Germanic mercenaries, who were disgruntled about pay and land. He defeats the last Western Roman military commander, captures Ravenna, and deposes the emperor.
The teenager, Romulus Augustulus.
The 16-year-old Romulus Augustulus, poetically named after Rome's founder and first emperor, Odoacer doesn't claim the title of emperor himself. He becomes king of Italy.
And he sends the imperial symbols, the robes, the diadem, to Constantinople.
He does, basically saying there's no need for an emperor here in the West anymore. One emperor in the East is enough. A hugely symbolic act.
What happened to Romulus Augustulus? Did Odoacer kill him?
Surprisingly, no. Odoacer treated him pretty well. Gave him a pension, let him retire to a nice villa near Naples, a remarkably gentle end for the last Western Roman emperor. But that moment, 476, it does mark something significant, doesn't it? Even if it wasn't a sudden collapse.
Undeniably. It's the first time in something like 700 years that Italy itself is ruled by a non-Roman king. The political structure of the Western Roman Empire is gone, replaced by these new Germanic kingdoms.
Which raises that question again, was 476 the fall, or just a change in management? The sources really emphasize that gradual decline, the death of 1,000 cuts. The political entity vanished in the West, but did Rome itself vanish? That distinction between the state and the culture is crucial.
So if we're trying to answer why did Rome fall, it seems clear there's no single bullet point. It's like a Jenga tower pulling out block after block until it becomes unstable.
That's a great analogy. It really was a systemic breakdown on multiple fronts. The sources are unanimous on that. No one reason. Many factors, all interacting, playing out over centuries. Historians have been arguing about the exact weighting since, well, the 5th century itself.
Okay, let's try to tease apart some of those main factors historians focus on. Leadership seems like a big one. Or lack thereof.
Definitely. Chronic political instability, particularly from the 3rd century onwards. Being emperor wasn't just powerful, it was incredibly dangerous. Because the power was near unlimited, everyone wanted it, leading to constant challenges, coups, assassinations.
That stat you gave earlier, 20 emperors in 75 years during part of the crisis.
Right. And assassination was the most common way to lose the job. Julius Caesar really started a trend there, unfortunately.
And when emperors did last, they weren't always great.
Often no. Many turned the empire into a personal piggy bank, a patronage mill for their friends and family. Corruption was rampant, undermining trust and effective governance.
And the Praetorian Guard sometimes just picked the next emperor. Or killed the current one.
Absolutely. If an emperor became unpopular or couldn't pay their bonuses, the Guard often just took matters into their own hands. They were kingmakers and killers.
Plus, you mentioned emperors becoming out of touch, like Honorius in Ravenna.
Yeah, moving the capital away from Rome might have made sense strategically, but it disconnected rulers from the Senate, from the heartland. And then you had succession issues, emperors passing power to young, incompetent sons, like Romulus Augustulus at 16, not exactly equipped to handle a collapsing empire.
And the old aristocracy, were they helping?
Often they were part of the problem. They became incredibly wealthy and powerful, sometimes richer than the central government. They'd manipulate weak emperors for their own gain, more focused on their estates than the empire's fate. With leadership like that, it's no wonder things went downhill.
Okay, bad leadership. What about the military? Rome's legions were legendary.
They were the foundation of the empire's power. Well-trained, well-paid citizen soldiers, loyal, disciplined. But as the empire's economy faltered and maybe fewer Roman citizens wanted to join up, recruitment became a huge problem.
So they couldn't fill the ranks.
Not easily with traditional recruits, so they increasingly turned to those foederati foreign mercenaries, filling the legions with Goths, Franks, Vandals.
The very people they were sometimes fighting.
Exactly. These soldiers often lacked the training, the equipment, and crucially, the loyalty of the old legions. They might never have even seen Rome. Their loyalty was to their commander, their pay, their own tribe, not the abstract idea of the Roman Empire.
So they might turn on Rome.
And they often did. if they weren't paid, or if their people were mistreated, or if a rival offered a better deal. Plus, constantly spending huge sums on the military, especially bribing these unreliable troops, drained money from everything else, infrastructure, administration, you name it, weakened the empire from within.
Which leads us to the economy. You mentioned inflation, lack of funds.
Economic collapse was fundamental. That 3rd century hyperinflation was devastating. But there was a deeper issue, too. Rome's economy relied heavily on conquest and slave labor.
Expanding meant more land, more resources, more slaves.
Right, but after Trajan, around 117 CE, expansion largely stopped. Emperors went on the defensive, even lost territory. No more major conquests meant no steady supply of new slaves to power the large estates and mines, no new plunder to fill the treasury.
So the whole economic engine sputtered.
It really did. Lack of funds hit everything. Less money for the army meant they couldn't afford quality recruits, had to cut corners, rely more on mercenaries. It's all connected, a vicious cycle.
Okay, leadership, military, economy. What about Christianity? You said it challenged Roman norms. Did it actively contribute to the fall?
That's one of the most debated points. It's complex. Christianity became legal in 313, the official religion in 380. Its monotheism, as we discussed, directly contradicted Roman traditions.
No more deified emperors, no easily integrating new gods.
Exactly. This arguably weakened the emperor's traditional authority, that divine mandate. It might have made integrating diverse populations harder, as religion was no longer that flexible tool of Romanization. Some argue it shifted focus away from the earthly empire towards heavenly rewards, maybe lessening civic commitment.
Challenge old certainties, as you put it.
Right. It introduced a fundamentally different worldview into the heart of Roman identity. Did it cause the fall? Probably too simplistic. But did it contribute to the changing social and political landscape, the erosion of old structures? Very likely, yes.
Another factor people mentioned is just size. Was the empire simply too big to manage?
It was definitely a huge challenge, nearly 2 million square miles at its peak. Imagine trying to get news from Hadrian's Wall to Rome. Weeks? Maybe longer. How do you effectively govern provinces that far away, respond quickly to wars on distant frontiers?
Diocletian tried to solve that with the Tetrarchy.
He did. Dividing it was a logical response to the sheer scale. But, as we saw, the division itself, especially the final east-west split, ended up weakening the West by cutting it off from the wealthier eastern provinces. The focus shifted to just protecting key cities, not managing the whole vast territory.
So size made administration and defense incredibly difficult.
Immensely so. And communication delays meant local governors and generals had huge autonomy, which could lead to rebellion or mismanagement.
Okay, one last major factor, often cited. That fatal mistake with the Goths.
Ah, yes, the mismanagement argument. The idea is, if Rome had handled the arrival of the Goths differently in the late 4th century, things might have gone better. Maybe the military, if well led and funded, could have decisively defeated them early on. They still had better training in gear, arguably.
Or could they have integrated them better?
That's the other side of the coin. Once the Goths were inside Roman territory, perhaps a more generous, well-managed integration policy, treating them fairly, giving them land, incorporating them properly into the army, and society could have turned them into loyal defenders instead of resentful enemies.
But Rome did neither.
According to this argument, Rome chose the worst path. Not strong enough to expel them, not wise enough to truly integrate them. Instead, they did this half measure. Exploit them, mistreat them, hire them as mercenaries, but keep them marginalized and distrusted.
Creating a large, armed, alienated population inside the borders.
Exactly, which inevitably led to more conflict, civil wars, loss of territory, and ultimately contributed significantly to the Western Empire's unraveling. A failure of policy, driven by arrogance or incompetence, with devastating consequences.
So bringing it all together, leadership failures, military decline, economic collapse, religious shifts, unmanageable size, policy blunders, it really does sound like death by 1,000 cuts.
It really does. Which raises that important question for you listening. Can we really isolate one cause when everything was so tangled together? The sources paint this picture of interconnected crises, each making the others worse. Thinking critically about how these pieces fit together is key to understanding what happened.
So the Western Roman Empire as a political entity did crumble. But you said earlier, the idea of Rome, its culture, its institutions, they didn't just vanish. It's like a phoenix rising from the ashes.
In many ways, yes. The legacy lived on, transformed, adapted, and continued to shape the world profoundly, which again challenges that simple idea of a fall.
How so? Where did Rome live on?
Well, first and most obviously, there's the Eastern Roman Empire. Byzantium. As we said, it survived for another 1,000 years after 476, until 1453. And crucially,
They called themselves Romans.
they absolutely did. They saw themselves as the unbroken continuation, preserving Roman law, Roman administration, Greek language and culture fused with Roman traditions and Christian faith. That's half the empire right there, not falling, but thriving for centuries.
Okay, so the East carried the torch. What about the West, where the empire supposedly fell?
Even there, it's more complicated. For many historians, 476 isn't an end, but maybe the start of the vibrant medieval world. Because even though the political structure collapsed, the cultural power of Rome remained immense.
How did that work? The new kingdoms, Franks, Goths, they didn't just erase everything.
Far from it. In many ways, these new kingdoms were like mini-Romes. Their leaders wanted to tap into the prestige, the legitimacy of Romanness. They adopted Roman law, sponsored poets writing in Latin, used Roman administrative techniques, even tried to restore Roman monuments. They were imitating Rome, not destroying its legacy entirely.
So Roman culture was still dominant, even without a Roman emperor.
Its hegemony persisted for a very long time. And perhaps the most powerful Roman institution of all carried on and grew even stronger.
Church.
The Roman Catholic Church. Relatively young in 476, but it had spread rapidly. As the Western Empire fragmented, the Church, with its organization, its bishops, its base in Rome, stepped into the power vacuum.
Became the de facto government, you said.
In many parts of Europe, for the next 1,000 years, yes. Kings sought the Pope's approval, the Church preserved learning, maintained social order, became the central institution of medieval European life. You could argue Rome's greatest institution not only endured but conquered Europe in a different way.
That's a powerful thought. Rome's legacy outliving its political form through the Church.
And beyond the Church, think about everyday things. The languages spoken across Southern Europe, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, they all evolved directly from Latin. English is full of Latin roots.
Our legal systems.
Yeah.
Technology.
Huge Roman influence on Western law. Roman engineering, roads, aqueducts, building techniques that knowledge wasn't entirely lost. It influenced medieval and later developments. Many major European cities started as Roman towns. Londinium became London. Lutetia became Paris.
And the image of Rome. Its power, its glory.
That's been incredibly persistent. So many later empires and nations have consciously looked back to Rome as a model. The British Empire, Tsarist Russia, Napoleonic France, the Founding Fathers in America, even chillingly, Nazi Germany, they all tried to borrow Rome's symbols, its architecture, its perceived glory, to legitimize themselves.
But they also inherited some of the same problems.
It absolutely did. The dilemmas of empire, the conflicts over expansion, the challenges of managing diverse populations, the temptations of absolute power, these are recurring themes. We're still wrestling with questions Rome faced. Where do our boundaries lie? Who belongs? What are the limits of inclusion?
That Tacitus quote you mentioned earlier comes to mind. They make a desert and they call it peace.
Exactly. That brutal clarity about the costs of empire. It's part of the Roman legacy, too. The conversation we can still have with the Romans, reading their historians, their poets, their philosophers, it forces us to think harder about ourselves, about power, civilization, decline, resilience, the problems we still share.
It really is like there's a bit of Rome inside all of us, in the West at least, shaping how we think about the world.
It's an enduring presence, which makes the question of its fall so fascinating because in so many ways, it never completely went away.
And there you have it. Our journey through the legendary, often perplexing but always fascinating story of the quote-unquote fall of Rome.
Not one simple answer, as we saw, but hopefully a clearer picture of the incredible resilience, the dramatic changes, and the really powerful enduring legacy.
We really hope this deep dive has given you plenty to chew on. It's a story that keeps revealing new layers the more you look.
And maybe it leaves you with a final question to ponder. Given everything we've discussed, Rome's transformations, the different ways people define its fall, its lasting influence, how do you define the end of an empire, or even a civilization? What truly marks an ending?
And looking around today, what elements of our own societies might be persisting or transforming, perhaps shedding one skin for another, in ways we don't always recognize? Does a civilization ever truly fall, or just change its form?